In the 1890s, the army of the Republic of France invaded the kingdom of Dahomey in Africa, and they found themselves facing a well-drilled, well-disciplined, professional standing army of Dahomeyan infantry, armed not with the spears that they expected, but with muzzle-loading smoothbore muskets, flintlock. These French soldiers were facing enemies who were equipped as the French had been just 100 years earlier. And it was a hard fight. The Dahomeyans stood their ground continuously, often fighting to the last man. When the conquest was completed, the French found thousands of volumes in the state library of just trade records documenting business deals that had taken place over the last 400 years, back to the 1500s. Dahomey had been keeping records as far back as the mid-1500s, written records of their trade and commerce, of their mining operations, of their farm production. The Kingdom of Dahomey was a literate civilization with a professional standing army and a standard currency of their own. And yet, by 1920, books in English and French portrayed Dahomey as a land of wild savages running around naked, who didn't even have spoken language, who had to be taught to speak by the French as part of the process of their being civilized. This is how colonialism works. You take people who are already civilized, they have civilization, and you conquer them and you subjugate them. And you deny that they ever had civilization. You deny that they ever had social organization. You deny that they ever had writing. You deny that they ever had language. And then you claim credit for everything that these people had previously had, that you have taken from them and then gradually feed back to them in limited doses. This is colonial democracy as it existed from its very beginnings in the 19th century. Dahomey was not a land of naked savages running around waiting for the French to teach them how to speak. It was a civilized agrarian society with a bureaucracy and writing. And the French marched in, took over, and destroyed it. The only thing they failed to destroy was the Dahomey monarchy itself, which they subjugated, humiliated, and brutalized, but were never able to completely eradicate. Today, Dahomey is a province within the state of Benin in Africa. And it is a historical record, a matter of historical record. And Dahomey is not the only example of this. Throughout the early through mid-20th century, colonialist writers, apologists, and propagandists rewrote the history of their colonized peoples to eradicate all evidence that these people had already had organized, centralized societies, that these people already had a form of civilization, that these people were already self-governing. Colonial democracy and capitalist democracy, quite literally two fingers on the same hand, gripped Africa firmly, and they erased the history of the African peoples of every sort. Now, there were peoples in Africa who had not yet achieved the level of basic industrialization that Dahomey had achieved, the ability to produce their own muskets, the ability to produce furniture, the ability to produce a few basic things that are needed for essentially a centralized state in the 17th, 18th century period. The people of Dahomey had these. The Zulu didn't. The Zulu were far more primitive, but even the Zulu had ironworking, a technology that was quite literally at that time 3,000 years old. So no, these people were not in the Stone Age. They were well into the Iron Age, at least. Unfortunately, colonial democracy was more intent on erasing their history than upon preserving it. And so the facts that we have about these people came from the notes of the soldiers, writing down detailed descriptions of what they were destroying on the battlefield in the period of the 1870s through the 1920s, as Africa was conquered, colonized, subjugated, and obliterated. But these people were not primitive savages. They were not wild animals. They already had civilization. And many of them already had writing systems in place. And they all had some form of centralized government. This was not the teaching of civilization to ignorant savages. This was the destruction of civilization to make way for colonial democracy and capitalist democracy. In other words, white rule. And these people's whole heritage was erased, brutally, violently, and utterly without mercy. Their entire heritage was erased. And to this day, they are still working to reclaim it. The various African kingdoms that were subjugated by the French, British, Belgian, Italian, and German empires under the Berlin Agreement in the 1870s. I think it was the 1870s. Maybe it was the 1880s. All of these African civilizations found themselves carved up, and the unnatural borders drawn upon their country are still affecting them to this day. Borders that run through the middle of countries that already existed to create new colonial entities that split up populations into separate zones of administration so that people from the same civilization might find themselves, maybe we are French subjects, maybe we are German subjects. But within a generation, they soon found themselves technically at war with their own people because their masters were at war with each other. This is colonialism in Africa, the carving up of a continent, regardless of the natural domestic borders that existed, and the erasure of all the history of these people, in order to be replaced by the myth of the white savior who came and taught them civilization. It's a myth that we can, in truth, completely do without. So maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to erase the myth of wild Africa being civilized by the white man and replace it with the truth. Africa was conquered, colonized, subjugated, and devastated by colonial and capitalist democracy. The same way that the Middle East is being carved up today. Oh, and it's February, Black History Month. Learn something about African civilization and about the history of Negroes in North and South America and the Caribbean. Something true, something that's not mythology created by the white man to justify keeping black people down. Dahomey already had a thriving civilization when the French arrived to civilize it. Something to think about.